meeting you right where you are on your foster care journey. This is the Forgotten Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Forgotten Podcast. I'm your host, Jamie Cabe, and I am so happy to be with you. If you are part of the foster care community, passionate about serving, or simply interested in learning more, we are here for you. In every episode of this podcast, you will hear stories from men and women who have experienced foster care to one degree or another. They may have grown up in the system, are caseworkers, foster parents, or others who are here to bring you hope or encouragement. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe and share it with a friend. And remember, you are not alone. I hope you enjoy the Forgotten Podcast. Corey Johnston, you are the lead pastor of Heights Community. You're a foster and adoptive father. And as we record today, in May, you are just about to celebrate 13 years of marriage with your wife, Andrea. That's good.
Yes.
That's good stuff.
It's incredible. Yes. Yeah.
I love
Very
it.
thankful.
And together I'm glad. I'm glad to hear that. Together, you guys have 3 children, including one son who you adopted, and you are currently fostering a 4th child. And then I have to say, also, you have 2 dogs. I also have 2 dogs.
Yes. Was one of your, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go. What were you going to ask?
I was going to ask if one of your dogs was a COVID purchase as well.
Yeah.
Because one of ours showed up during COVID.
I saw that and apparently the pit bull you bought at a very low point in your life. So I'm feeling a sense of regret for both of these dogs.
At times, yes. At times.
We had a dog. We've had a dog for a long time. And then our other dog wasn't a COVID purchase, but he was a very spontaneous purchase while in Florida on vacation.
Oh, okay. I bet that was a fun drive back. Yes.
It was so fun. I was very excited about it. My husband thought we were crazy, and we were. We had to drive him 20 hours back in the car. But he did great, and I thought maybe, just maybe, God had given me the perfect puppy. But that was not the case soon after we got home. So I connect with you on the dog situation here. But moving into your personal story, Corey, your story really includes a lot of trauma and hurt. And it's really as a result of being raised by parents who were caught in addiction and the impact that had on you. I would just love, wherever you want to start, but what are some things you saw and experienced in your childhood?
Yeah, so thankfully I've been able to use my story over the last 14 years or so of ministry, to just bring a great deal of value. And so it has been an incredible experience. And so some of the things I saw, I was raised by drug addicts. And so there's a great deal of abuse that I got to witness, and so that would be emotional, not so much physical for me, but a lot of emotional abuse, a lot of neglect, just being left alone at a very early age, very young age, for like seasons, longer periods of time, and so I had a mom that was a drug addict from the time she was 15 until she passed away a few years ago at 62, 63. Wow. My father died of a cocaine overdose when I was 7 years old in a hotel room with a woman who was not my mom. And then I had like 3 or 4 or more, perhaps, stepfathers before 4th grade. And so a lot, what did you experience? You can kind of infer a great deal of neglect, emotional abuse, and then just a lot of like trauma through experiences, just literal physical experience, relational experiences during that time. As a little guy, so.
Wow. Yeah. And did you have any siblings?
I do. Both of them are older. And so I have a sister who's 6 years older. And then I have a brother who is 12 years older. And so he and I are not as close. He moved out whenever he was 12 and I was born. And then my sister was really a mother, very mother-like figure for me. And so when our mom would binge or leave or whatever she had going on, we didn't always know. That was kind of who took the role of mom for me, was my older sister, who was only, again, just 6 years older than I was. So.
Oh, my goodness. And so really your entire life is, you never knew your mom without addiction.
Oh, no, not except for, not except for whenever she was in jail or, in a rehab. But normally, as I got older, I realized rehab was really just a way to not go to jail, But yeah, I would only really know her for while she was incarcerated or then the short period thereafter. And I even remember, to add to some of the trauma here is I remember like praying at times that my mom would get arrested. And even like there's an experience where she got out of something and I like begged the police officer. I was like, could you please put her in jail? Just because I knew like no one wants their mom to go to jail. Right. But I just knew that like that would be then a season by which I would get to experience my mother in the way really like God had intended her to love me, unfortunately, in that regard. But yeah, so no, I never really knew her apart from addiction.
Wow. Well, I appreciate you sharing that, first of all. I recognize this as I talk to more and more people who've had experiences similar to yours, that it is not, I understand as much as I can that this is not necessarily, it impacts you to share this. It is not necessarily easy to talk about, but you do it because you do care about other people and you want other people to grow or to see or to understand. And I just want to thank you for that.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
As you think about like growing up then, you experienced all of this stuff, you saw it. How did that then impact you and some of the ways you made decisions?
Yeah. Well, at that time in my life, I made terrible decisions. and so, I started following my mom and then dad, even though I did not know him, their footsteps in fifth grade. And so what's asinine about that is that I have a fourth grader that will become a fifth grader in the next 3 days,
Oh my.
And so I look at this sweet little girl and I'm like, oh my gosh, like that is a crazy story, because I don't want to get too far off track, but you can share your story so much so it begins to lose some of the weight of it. And so as I walked in onto a field trip just last week with my daughter, who's incredible, I was like, oh my gosh, like she'll be my age whenever I started habitually and regularly smoking and selling marijuana in fifth grade, and I started drinking in eighth grade. And then by the time I become a freshman in high school, I had kind of experimented with almost everything. And then I kind of graduated to then selling, things at parties and so on and so forth. And so it impacted me because in a negative way, of course, during that time, because in some ways you don't really know any different.
Right.
Like this is just my life.
How could you?
And right. And this is my environment. Now the clash in my worldview came whenever my mom went to jail. I was in going into seventh grade, and she got locked up for a year or so. And I moved in with my grandparents, who were always consistent for me. They were unbelievable, an unbelievable means of grace from the Lord to me. And I didn't come to faith when I was there, but I got to see stability, and I got to see like, oh, this is what it looks like to have meals. Like that's normal. Normal families have normal. I use the word normal loosely, of course, but normal families in quotations. Oh, they eat 3 times a day, and they have to be home at a certain time, and there are repercussions to your actions, and and so there, then whenever I was there, I didn't lash out as much because I didn't really need to. And so I've learned in hindsight, looking back on my childhood, much of my lashing out was like a desire to be seen. But whenever I was brought into a family that had stability, I was seen, and it was hard because like, I don't want to follow all the rules. I don't want to do this. I don't want to do that. And at the same time, you feel loved, and you're like, well, what do you do with that? And it's similar to like the way the Lord looks at us and he says, I love you enough to tell you no. Like there is grace and there's mercy. Here are my commands, not because they save you, but like respond to me in light of my commands out of a position of love, and it'll go seemingly well. There's of course sin and whatnot, but so he just says like, I love you enough to tell you no, like all throughout the sscripture. And so I got to experience both of those, I don't see you, and then I also see you.
Wow. Wow. I want to talk more about your grandparents, but before we do, you had mentioned earlier you had 4 or more stepfathers, quote unquote, through all the way, through your childhood up to 4th grade. And you had mentioned previously that there was one particular father that proved to really be beneficial in opening your eyes to the world around you. Will you tell us more about him and why you said that?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'm from a small town of Metropolis, Illinois, 7,200 people, kind of the beginning of the Bible Belt. It's for being a metropolis, it is not,
right.
It's quite the opposite, as a matter of fact. And so there, it's a predominantly white community. And so the man who stuck around that I mentioned was a black man, African-American, as he would prefer to be called, which was so instrumental for me that he was not like a good father figure by any means, because he too was wrapped up in addiction. But what was beautiful is that it really grew my worldview in a different way from being in a predominantly white family. And then having now, lo and behold, entering into 4th grade, now I get this whole other side of this family that is most certainly not white. And so for me, you don't really realize it maybe at the time, but as I've gotten older, I'm like, oh man, that's been so helpful for me as a man, just kind of looking at culture and finding grace, seeing grace, seeing mercy in that, taking time to understand cultural differences. There's no need to be ethnocentric. We are literally the melting pot. And so we should be able to recognize and appreciate cultures and subcultures that exist therein. And so for me, it was helpful. And even also in many ways to experience racism, to see racism against a culture different from mine, but also then to experience even in some ways racism from a culture that was different from mine.
Interesting.
And, we were one of, I don't even know, probably 2 or 3 biracial families in my community as a whole. And so that whole thing is just kind of, I think in many ways has helped me, especially as a pastor, as a father, to just be a little bit more appreciative of diversity and culture that exists. And even in there to see even in the midst of incredible trauma, the Lord was present in that little aspect of my story to mold me into who I get to be now, as a pastor, as a father, as a husband, as a coworker, as a boss, as a whatever word you want to put in there. I rarely view myself as a boss, but whatever word you want to put in there. And so it's really beautiful to know that was just a touch of God's kindness, not knowing how it would benefit me later as I live in the St. Louis area, which is quite the opposite of very Southern Illinois, small metropolis,
Yes.
And so I'm thankful for that. Yeah.
I love that. And it just reminds me, I had Davey Blackburn on a while back, and he has gone through just a horrific story of trauma, of loss. But he started a ministry called Nothing is Wasted Ministries. I think of this often. I think of it when I'm going through a struggle. I think of it when I talk with people like you, Corey, who've gone through a lot of hurt and trauma in childhood and so on. And it is just the grace of our God. He does allow pain to enter our lives, right? We live in a broken world. However, he does not waste anything, and he uses it. And like you said, that thing that seemed like nothing to you at the time necessarily, or even maybe something that felt more inconvenient, more difficult at the time, has actually proved to be helpful.
Yes. Yeah. I listened to that podcast.
Did you?
And yes. Yeah, of course. And gosh, to hear, I guess I don't want to share. He can share. Listen to the podcast, by the way,
Listen
plug
to
it down
his
below.
podcast. Yes.
But man, as he spoke of his wife and the reality that suffering does come, but the beauty of being able to better identify with a suffering servant, and just all these things that he had to say about that. I was like, oh my gosh, and I don't remember exactly how he worded it, but basically in effect saying God has extended you the grace that you need in that moment to sustain you in that moment. And God's grace God is gracious, yes, but he does give us the grace necessary to sustain us in the midst of suffering. And as he talked about that, I was like, oh my gosh, if I wasn't in my car listening, I've been standing up, dude. I was like, let's go. It was so good. It was so good to listen to him talk. And
I'm so glad to hear that. Yeah, it was
awesome.
So good for me as well. He also shared weep, but don't wallow.
Yes, that's right.
I remember that one too.
Yes.
I just used that just the other day.
Yeah. As he was talking, I was like, I want to be this guy's friend. This is I want to hang out with him. So, yes.
Baby, you heard it here. Corey,
That's right.
Corey wants to be your friend.
That's right. I do. It was so encouraging. It was so good.
Yeah. I love it. I love it.
So,
And that's how the body of Christ encourages one another. That's a beautiful thing, right? Of being able to share each other's stories and share stories and meet people and
absolutely
encourage one another and onward and forward.
Right. Yeah. As you,
go ahead.
I was going to say, just as you read the book of Hebrews, we're going through Hebrews right now, and it says, exhort one another as long as today is today, like as long as the day ends in Y, exhort one another. And like, that Greek word there, parakaleo, it means a few things, but one, it means to counsel and like to genuinely just sit and be present and hear from one another, and then not just sit there, but to lament with those who need to lament, and then celebrate with those who get to celebrate, and remind them of the gospel narrative and show them how the Lord speaks to them in that, and just this beautiful reality. And I think you do that really great with the work that you do. So thank you for being a part of our counseling along the way. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Okay, Corey, so your grandparents, you talked about them, and I think it's easy and natural to listen to that and go, okay, awesome. So he had grandparents who loved him, who loved Jesus. They even took you to church. So then everything turned out okay, right?
Right. Yeah, that's it. That's exactly right. No Jesus necessary, just a bunch of just a bunch of doing the right works, and it worked out. Yeah. Not at all.
It's just not the case, is it?
No, ma'am, that is not the case at all. The Lord has done all of this. And so it is important to note, as we talked about briefly prior to this, is my grandparents were unbelievable. I mean, my grandpa was a World War II vet, pipe fitter, would give you the shirt off his back. Thankful for that man. Any bit of work ethic and drive that I have, the Lord put him in my life to instill that in me, for sure. My grandmama was again, I'll use the word stereotypical very loosely, but for where we were living, a very stereotypical grandmother. She had brownies out on the dining room table and a little crystal, and there was 3 meals a day. And I remember her pulling cast iron pans out of the oven without a mitt. Like this, she was incredible, right?
Man.
Yes, she was that's what she loved. She loved being in the home. And so, yes and amen. They would take me to church, and I would go with them. But the church I went to was very fundamentalist, I think is the best way to word that. And so they didn't really maybe notice the difference there. But now that I kind of know the gospel, I'm like, oh, wow, that was a dangerous atmosphere in some ways. And they were not very kind to me. One, because of the biracial relationship that my mom was in. That was part of it. That pastor would actually say things like, if you're in with a Southern accent, if you're in a biracial relationship, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. I'm like, I think he's talking to us. That's pretty specific, And so my experience with my grandparents was incredible. My experience with the church across the board was not. I didn't really care to go. I would show up to take high C out of the fridge when I was supposed to be in Sunday school and walk home and drink it on the way, So I didn't really care to be there. But my grandparents, they were fortunately not like that. Very loving, very kind, gracious individuals. And I even remember my grandfather sharing the gospel with me as a young boy. And like something in me like igniting, but it was not regeneration. I did not come to faith, but I knew in that moment, like above everything, that there is something better and there is someone better. But the moment my mama would get out, man, I would go home. And in that, like I always say, like, regardless of the relationship, every son wants to be his mom's son.
Yes.
And so no matter how she treated me or what she did to me, I just wanted to be with my mom. I wanted her to be my mom. I wanted things to be right. I had hope in that. And so I would go back home. And as I would go home, I would then begin to just spiral right back into the things that she did, because she's who I look to as my role model. So
I think that is so important to hear. And what do you attribute that desire to? Always wanting to be your mom's son.
Yeah. So I think that's part of the Imago Dei, the image of God. And we look at creation. I'm going to start preaching, it's not Sunday, but if you look at Genesis, you see humanity have been created. Like God has instilled certain things in us, like dignity and purpose and value and longing for relationship and connectivity. And so I think that there's a reality there where he has instilled in us this desire to to be parented, to be loved and nurtured and pursued and wooed, and like all of the things that Jesus does as the better father and as the better son for us. And at the same time, then like, I think he's instilled in us to want to parent, right? To want to have kiddos in many ways. And so for those who get to, praise the Lord. And for those who are suffering because they cannot, it's, of course there's suffering that happens there. And so I genuinely believe it's just part of bearing the image of God. We see a father-son relationship or a parent-son relationship, obviously all throughout the scriptures. All things are pointing to Christ coming. And in that, I think it's sown into us. And so even though in the midst of trauma and tragedy and brokenness, I still think that there is a desire in there for my mom. And I think that desire then is a foreshadowing of an even deeper and greater desire to be in relationship with Christ, to ultimately find everything I could ever long for in my mom. Like the Lord Jesus himself has stepped in and said, hey, I am everything you could ever hope for. I'm everything you could ever long for as a son. Come to me, sit at my feet.
Yes. It's beautifully stated, and I think it's absolutely true. I'm not sure how to say this exactly, because I'm just hearing you say you wanted to be with her because you wanted. It's not that you wanted what was happening necessarily. You wanted what could be, right? Or what should be. And you always kept that hope because that was born in you. Again, like you said, that really ultimately points to the only one provider, parent figure. But God created family.
That's right.
And as parents, we're supposed to help point our kids to Christ.
That's
and
right.
be a representative of him.
Yeah.
Not perfect, obviously. That's not possible.
That's exactly
but a representative of him.
That's right. Yeah, type. Yeah, and I think sometimes folks don't know to even consider in their own story, or perhaps even as a foster father, an adoptive father, that there's a reality where you can experience grief that comes from the hope not being accomplished. And then you have to wrestle with like, I've really longed for this. Like, I really, really want this to happen. And that thing does not happen, which produces in like another level of grief because you're mourning the loss of something that you wish could come, if that makes sense the way that I say that. And so like we've also experienced, miscarriages in our family and my wife and I's family. And you're like, okay, so why am I so sad? And sure, there's a plethora of reasons why I'm sad, why I'm upset. But it's like, I hoped for this sweet baby girl to be born who now has a name, and I have an image in my head. And will she be brunette like me and green eyes, or will she be blue eyed and blonde hair like my sweet 10-year-old and mom is, And then that goes away. And you're like, oh, now I'm like stuck in the grief of what I hoped was to come, which is a whole nother like level of, in my opinion, grief anyway. And so we think about our own stories. It's not just the trauma that happens, but there's like all these deeper avenues and levels that you have to like really learn how to, I think, invite people, but also like the Lord to come and sit with you, this good counselor as it says he is. And so just still learning that at 38, like, oh man, there's all these things I hope for. And yet I continue to find myself in grief,
Yes. Yes. Well, I relate to that as well. And we had a failed adoption where we had tried to adopt a little girl from Uganda and had her referral for months, and even went and stayed with her for 10 days, went home. Ultimately, the judge said no. And it was heart-wrenching, because, you had dreams and hopes and you met her and all of the things. And yet, God has also taught me so much through grief and disappointment, right? And he has proven himself faithful. So I appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We brought in a counselor just this last weekend to do some grief counseling with our leaders, about 35 leaders, so we're working hard for to build a good culture of emotional intelligence in our church body. And begins with the top, begins with our leaders and comes down. And one of the things he said this last weekend to all of us was grief is not just an emotion, but it's a process. It's like all of the emotions. And so he talked about what it meant to grieve. And the reason that we grieve is because we feel anchored and sure of something. Like there's something that brings us steadiness and stability. So perhaps it is an adoption or the hope of a biological child. And you begin to anchor yourself in that reality. And like, these things are going to be true and they're going to be good. And then there's a disorientation that comes, the loss of a kid in utero or the loss of adoption. And the thing that you once found yourself tethered so tightly to is kind of stripped from you. And he said, and like that, all that emotion that comes with that. And it is a lot of like, now am I a father or am I not a father? Like, am I healthy or am I unhealthy? Am I, there's all these things he says, and that's what brings that disorientation. And so folks think that grief is just going to kind of come as this emotion, but that's why it feels like such a wave. And you can walk into a house and have a smell hit you. And you're grieving all of a sudden, or you see a sweet little girl, brown haired girl in my case, perhaps, and I'm like, oh, I wonder if that's what she would, now a new emotion has hit me. So he says grief is not just an emotion, although it is, but it's also a process of like the plethora of emotions that come. And so that's why I think you rarely stop grieving, like you continue to grieve throughout time. And so there's just this really beautiful moment he shared with us last weekend.
That's awesome. I think of that, with our little girl, we had the dress she wore when we met her. We brought it home, so it's hanging in my closet. So when I see that, I don't see it all the time, but there's times it hits me. Yeah.
Oh, that's so sad and hard.
It is hard. And yet, this God was so faithful because she's okay. And he even provided us to be able to see her again, see that she was in a stable situation. It also opened the door to us to bring in our younger son, who we would have never, who needed us. So it's like, as hard as it was and how it can still provoke pain, I trust the Lord more, right?
Yes.
And that's what you learn on your relationship with Jesus is he knows better and he allows things for whatever reason.
That's right.
And so I can look back actually with thankfulness that it didn't go the way I hoped, because so many reasons,
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. We had two big experiences that happened that led us to be foster parents. And one of them was taking in a kid from our neighborhood, unofficially fostering him, if I may, just took him in because that's what needed to happen. The second were the miscarriages that we experienced as a family that led us to then foster our first foster, whose name is Kason, that we've now adopted. And we look at those two situations, and one where our first pseudo foster, unfortunately, has been found to he's been charged with first-degree murder. And so he's now in prison. We're going to go, we've seen him once just last month. We're going back this month to see him very young. He got in trouble at 16. He's been locked up for 3 years now. And you're like, there's all these things that come from that. And you're like, Lord, what? I would have never chosen this. And I would still not choose that, to be clear.
No.
What are you going to do with this? How can you make this good? And then we have miscarriages. We're like, how can you make this good? And then we get this little boy who's addicted to heroin. And we're like, how can this be good? And so there's just all these questions, I was thinking about Abraham in light of that in Genesis, whenever God's making a covenant with him. And he says, but how will I know, Lord? How will I know that I'll inherit the land? How do I know I'm going to have a baby? And I feel like more often than not, when suffering comes, I'm like, how do I know? How do I know that you're good? How do I know this is going to happen? So I love that the Bible is so real and gives us these little nuggets of truth, but we get to foster. And now, like, you look 4 years later, and we have 30 plus foster families in our church body. And we have foster moms and adoptive parents and biological parents of those kids, like worshiping Jesus, and you're like, oh, okay. It doesn't take away all the pain, to be clear, but you're like, I don't know everything, but I at least see something that you were doing in that moment, and so we would just never, in and of ourselves, ever choose suffering.
No.
And yet it is regularly suffering that brings about the most sanctification, where we look the most like Christ when it's over. We're going to let's celebrate and party. And he's like, well, yeah, but let's also refine you a little bit. And it takes some fire to do so. And so, so learning to be more and more thankful for those times, for sure. And trust as I look back and say, okay, you were faithful then, just like the song, God, you were faithful then, you'll be faithful to us now. You are the same God,
Yes.
So
Yes. And then living like this with hands open.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. So hard.
That's
But
my
yes,
goal. Yeah,
that's
it
right.
is. It's
Yeah.
hard, but I've said this many times on the podcast, but one habit, and actually just to name another podcast guest, Justin Whitmore Early, his book, The Common Rule, he was on the podcast and talked about different rhythms to build into your day. And one of them was pray first thing in the morning on your knees. And so that has just become something that I've really held on to. And I just roll right out of bed and just get on my knees and lift my hands to him and say, the day is yours, Lord.
That's right. Yeah.
And
that's right.
that's how I want to live. And sometimes I need to be reminded of that throughout the day. But it is such a good, healthy way for me to start because it just puts my mind right on him from the beginning.
That's right. That's right. That's right. And messy hair and morning breath. And he says, in Christ, hon, it is yours. That's right.
Yes.
You are my daughter and who I'm well pleased with today.
That's right. That's
now
right.
go brush your teeth.
Yeah. I love it. We've talked a lot about the gospel, which is just my favorite thing to talk about.
Sure.
I can't get enough of what God has done for us. But you mentioned that, or you believe that everything has to be rooted in the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything that you just have on your heart that you want to share that pertains to that and pertains to what we've been talking through today?
I think the thing that comes to mind most, and let me clarify what I mean by that, is I think that the gospel is more than just a means of salvation, although it is very much that.
Yes.
And so whenever I say everything is rooted in the gospel, what I'm saying is that the gospel provides us a framework by which we should see the world around us. And so just like I would, if I take my glasses off right now, everything's real fuzzy, I can kind of still see the world. I can make out the books over here on the shelves and see your face a bit, but it's not until I put my glasses right back on, that everything becomes more clear. And so in light of that, that's how we think about the gospel here at Heights Community, is that it is a framework and it is the meta narrative of not just Jesus, but of all of creation, as we began the conversation speaking about. And so the thing I think that is most important is, as you're inviting in people to share very real and heavy things, even celebratory things, because good things point us to the foreshadowing and the goodness of the Lord as well, right?
Yes.
But in the midst of suffering, we need the gospel as we call it a meta narrative, or again, as a framework by which we get to put our story into. And so often what I've experienced in the church, and keep in mind, I wasn't raised in church. I'm just experiencing the church for 14 years since I've come to faith. And we can talk about that too at some point if you'd like to. It's a beautiful story of redemption.
Yes.
What I've learned is that a lot of people are trying to fit Jesus into their story. And so instead of looking at the gospel and saying, oh, that is good and right, how does that speak to me? They're trying to force him in. I don't know how else to say that right now, but in almost a legalistic attempt, you're trying to force him in, or they'll kind of say some real Christian things well, God is good, isn't he? And you're I just told you I lost a child. Of course I believe that. And so what I've just learned that we need to do is, one, just ask good questions, be present, practice active listening. And then maybe after we've sat for a while, maybe grieved with someone for a while, maybe not even the same day, then come in and say, hey, your story reminds me of this. Or as you were talking, now that I kind of got to know you a bit, I'm not going to just hit you with something somebody told me to say to you in passing in a book or whatever, but I'm going to genuinely say, your story of loss reminds me of, let's say, Abraham and Sarah. Your story of loss reminds me of not only that, but of this about Jacob and his situation. Or then let's get to your story of loss. Who better to sit with you and relate to you than a father who gave up his son for you? And so if the father can relinquish the son, and not just the son, but every bit of his inheritance for you, you don't have to believe this to be true right now, although it is, but who better to rely on, who better to trust in, who better to find your hope in. And so we do a lot of work with story within our church, where every other year, we take about 6 to 8 months. And I've kind of written up this framework that we use, where we invite our church body to start sharing their testimonies, but we call them stories. You can call it testimony if you'd like. But we've learned just because you have a story doesn't always mean you have a testimony. We have a lot of non-believers in our church who aren't celebrating that they've come to faith. They're still seeking. They're still skeptical,
Yep.
And so a big portion of our church is that, and they're openly verbal about that, which is like unbelievable, like gift that God has given us. And so we do a lot of work with story. And so we have to actually sit and listen, practice active listening. We're not allowed to respond to them. We're only allowed to ask questions to like invite out as much as they're willing to give.
That's so cool.
And then we sit and we say like, hey, where did we see creation at? Just like we talked about in the beginning, like, oh, she has strength, she has dignity, she has value, she's been given purpose. Like, let's start there instead of jumping to the fall first, And so we start with creation and then we move to the fall. Like, now let's talk about where do you see broken relationship at in here? I won't get into all this, but there's 4 aspects of broken relationships that we can quickly identify in the fall. And it's like, where do you see that at? And like, okay, so how is Jesus better? And how does Jesus provide? And let's talk about his life and his death and his resurrection. And so all of that to say, like, I think it's super important that we don't use the gospel just as a track to bring someone to faith or teach someone, well, now that you've come to faith, now that you believe, now Jesus has showed up. Like, no, like he's sovereign God over all of creation and all of time and the whole universe. Like he was there. And so even in my personal story, then I'll kind of say this lastly for you to comment
I would
on
love to hear
this portion. Okay. So even in my personal story, then like whenever I look at the disruption, of course, of like my mom and that relationship, and while I wasn't a Christian with my grandparents, like a loving father gave me loving parents. And even that would be my grandparents. And even if, let's say my grandparents weren't in the equation, okay, for those that are like, well, he went to church some, and then that's how he came to faith. We can talk about my coming to faith story in a moment. Even if all I had was a 6-year older sister that like loved me well while I was shook and scared and like wondering, like, is mom going to come home? And like, when will she be back? And who's going to sit with me after I go sit with her in jail at 11 years old? Like, I have a 17-year-old sister that's like momming me during that. That's an act of God's kindness and a means of grace that he gave me her, And so like it took actually me sharing my story in my own church as someone who coaches this and teaches this like regularly and often for this like sweet single gal to sitting with me listening. She was like, well, the way I see God redeeming you is your sister. And I see the way, one of the ways God was redeeming you was through your best friend's mom that took you in after she experienced the loss of a son. And I was like, oh my gosh, she's just lighting me up. And I don't know why, like, a veil over my eyes, perhaps, and that I just hadn't even thought about it. I always give credit to my grandparents, but it wasn't until I shared my story in the company of solid, good Christian, gospel-centered Christians that this like single woman is the one who was like, hey, I see Jesus right there. And I see him there and I see him over there. And I was like, oh yes, thank you, Lord, for your goodness.
That's awesome.
And so hopefully that makes some sense to you. It's kind of a long way of saying it, but
I absolutely love it. And I do want to hear your story of how you came to faith.
Yeah. Well, for those that are like, well, yeah, he had some Christian grandparents and a Southern Baptist church. Like, what more do you need? Like, turns out we still need Jesus and the Holy Spirit to do some work. Turns out there's more to it. Yeah. Well, for my story, as we mentioned, I followed my mama's footsteps, all the way up through into to and through high school for sure. Went to college at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. There's this hottie, of course, working at the front. Her name was Andrea. I found out shortly after that, who became one of my best friends, who later becomes my wife and who I have now. She's unbelievable. She should totally be on here and not me. You would just fall in love with her. She's lights up the whole room when she comes in. And so my story was like, I was the bad boy and she was, unfortunately, now that I have a daughter, she was into that. I was like, oh gosh. Well, my coming to faith was, I didn't walk an aisle. I didn't even go to church. I had a great deal of resentment even towards the American church. And some of that was me throwing stones at the bride. And I didn't quite recognize that at the time. But whenever I came to faith, I woke up in Andrea's bed, who's now my wife. She was just my girlfriend at the time. That was the life that we were living. That's the life that I was leading her into very irresponsibly. And I literally just woke up and God called me to faith, called me a son, and he called me into student ministry simultaneously. And I roll over and I look at her in bed after a night of partying, keep in mind, that was my whole life. And I was like, hey, I think God just called me to be a youth pastor. I didn't know to even say, called me to
my
faith or
goodness.
sonship.
Oh,
I said,
my
hey, I
goodness.
think God just called me to be a youth pastor. And she says, you need to change some things about yourself. And so I just laugh, and now in hindsight, I'm like, hold on, she needed to change some things about herself also, and who is she? And so I'm just kidding, but we were both a mess at that time. And she's like, what are you going to do? And I said, man, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. And I didn't know any story in the Bible except for whenever Saul is knocked off his horse. And later they start using his name as Paul. And she tells me one day, it's so funny. She tells me one day, she's like, hey, that's kind of like you. Saul was a really bad guy. I'm like, hey, come on now, shots fired. She's like, well, I mean, it worked out, but I was like, it did work out. She's like, but that was the only story that I even knew of the scriptures. And 4 months, I lost all my friends, the people that would say they were my friends, with the exception of a guy named Jeff Nail, who I planted Heights Community with. We planted our church together. And then a woman who's my kind of executive assistant. She never left me, which is beautiful. And then my wife, who's obviously still in my corner. I call her my cut man by all measures, man. When I get beat down in this world and in this role specifically, as a lead pastor of a pretty thriving, growing church, she's my cut man for sure. She keeps me in place. 4 months is all it took. Lost all my friends. 8 months went by and I was enrolled in seminary, Covenant Seminary over here in St. Louis area. Incredible seminary, a great space to be in, great place to go. And I had a job as a youth pastor. And I took a $43,000 pay cut to go make, I don't even know, $11,000 or $12,000, to go do it. And the Lord was just faithful. I'll tell you what, faithful.
I love that.
Yeah. So praise God for his faithfulness.
That's incredible. Man, Corey, thank you so much. We could talk and talk and talk, but
Sure.
we're going to have to close it out here. I appreciate your just who you are and how you continue to point us to Christ.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Thank you for being on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity just to come on and share a little bit with you. It was really beautiful and fun. So thank you.
Well, I hope that today's episode encouraged you wherever you are on your foster care journey. We want you to stay connected, so be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you will never miss an episode. Also, we have great content at theforgotteninitiative.org. Thank you for watching. I cannot wait to be with you next time.